I'm moving on. Tomeg Bogarai Mosh the Hella, Social Democrats. Ich to Catherne Murphy.
The daily numbers for COVID might be less than they were a week or two ago, but they're still extremely high, as are the alarming number of reported deaths. We're in the middle of a crisis with no end in sight. The UK variant, with its increased transmissibility, resulted in flights being suspended from late December in recognition of that increased risk from the variant. Between the 11th of December and the 3rd of January, 118,000 passengers arrived by air and a further 20,000 arrived by sea. We know there was a requirement on all passengers to fill out a passenger locator form. According to a response to a question I tabled to the Minister for Health, I got those figures on the 14th of January, but I was also told passengers who don't claim an exemption, such as air and sea crews or those travelling onward, including to Northern Ireland, are followed up and contacted by text to confirm the address, and if they don't respond, they get one or more phone calls. Ultimately, I was told that 51% of those gave their place of residence, and that means a whopping 49% didn't confirm where they were staying. We're currently seeing people being fined for travelling beyond the 5 kilometres if they don't have a good reason to do so, and the contrast is not lost on the public. While none of us like losing our freedoms and none of us want to see international travellers restricted, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and such high levels of non-compliance has to be a risk and has to be extending or prolonging our lockdowns and everything that goes with it. Taoiseach, I raised this issue with you in relation to international travel on the 4th of November, and I said that it seemed we were taking a fingers crossed approach in terms of compliance. You told me, and I quote, "One of the issues we're going to have to consider is enforcement. As the Deputy knows, at the moment, the requirement for a person to restrict his or her movements having come from abroad is not mandatory." You went on to say, "One thing we're giving consideration to as a government is whether we need to make mandatory, make legally enforcement, the requirement for a person to restrict his or her movements or self-isolate in certain circumstances. Since January the 9th, when flights resumed, passengers originating from the UK, South Africa and since any South American country are advised to self-isolate for a period of 14 days following their arrival." The key word here, Taoiseach, is advised. That was according to a PQ I got yesterday from the Minister for Transport. Where is the enforcement, Taoiseach, that was being talked about in November? Obviously, the risks have to be managed until the vaccine provides the protection that gives us some semblance of normality. And we know that there are risks from new variants. We also know that we need an all-Ireland approach, yet we're not providing information that has been repeatedly sought from our Northern Ireland counterparts. Why is that? My questions are: the 49% who didn't provide an address, what are the government going to do about that non-compliance? Where is the enforcement?
Thank you.
And what additional measures are seriously being considered? For example, are you looking at mandatory quarantines in designated hotels? And what are you going to do in relation to Northern Ireland and the request for information?
Thanks. Thanks very much, Deputy. The passenger location form has been in place for many months, as you know. Hasn't worked out to be as robust a measure as was needed, and that's why the government has made changes in recent weeks in response to the fact that we're now concerned about new variants entering the country from other parts of the world. So now anybody who's entering the state by air or by sea, with the exception of supply chain workers, hauliers and pilots, for example, and cabin crew, have to have a PCR test. They have to have had a PCR test within 72 hours of arriving in the country, and they have to produce evidence of that. And there's a very high degree of compliance when it comes to that. It is working very well. I know it's not 100% in terms of stopping the virus coming into the country, but it is working very well, and it is mandatory. And there are fines, and files have been sent by the Gardaí to the DPP on this for people who have arrived without evidence of a negative test. the amount of people travelling in out of the country now is very, very low. It's down to about 33,000 people a week. But that is people who are travelling for essential reasons. And quarantining for that many people for 14 days in a hotel with closed windows would be 66,000 people. And these are people who generally are involved in essential travel, coming back for a funeral, maybe seeing a dying relative, a supply chain worker or a crucial worker who's come to fix a machine in a hospital, for example. So this is essential travel, and we do need to make sure that we don't cut off essential travel entirely, because sometimes it is necessary. In terms of anything we might do in the future, I think we need to bear in mind three things: our citizens' rights, our EU rights as EU citizens, proportionality, and the situation with regard to Northern Ireland. First of all, proportionality. At the moment, if somebody tests positive for COVID in Ireland, we don't detain them. We don't put them in a hotel with security guards. So if we were to take people who have come in from overseas, Irish people returning home, citizens coming back from overseas who have a negative test for COVID, and if we were to detain them in a hotel for 14 days, that would be disproportional, because there are lots of people in Ireland who we know have tested positive for COVID, and we don't seek to detain them. And unfortunately, some of them don't self-isolate when they're supposed to be, so we'd have to consider the proportionality of it. The other is citizens' rights. We are EU citizens. There is freedom of movement. We do have the right to travel, study and work anywhere in the European Union. And that can only be constrained in very particular circumstances. And then there is the obvious issue of Northern Ireland. A zero COVID policy, a very strict 14-day border quarantine might make sense in a country that can control its borders. We can't in the same way because of the open land border with Northern Ireland, which we don't want to close. Now, if the UK, as has been suggested, although I understand that those suggestions are not advanced, if the UK were to bring in border quarantine, we might be able to do something on a two-island basis, but it's not going to work on a two-thirds of an island
We're over
basis.
time. Thank you. Deputy.
Taoiseach, the non-compliance with the passenger locator form tells us something about non-compliance. And we also know that the PCR test, while it is required and it is mandatory, we know that on its own isn't sufficient, and there's a second test required within a number of days. I know that the people coming in from the UK and from other countries like South Africa are supposed to quarantine for 14 days. Is there an exception to that? Is there an exception because their travel is required for business or for other reasons? Is that a requirement full stop, or is it not a requirement full stop? Why are we not providing that information to our counterparts in Northern Ireland? If we want an all-Ireland approach, we have to play our part too. So why are we not giving them information that has been repeatedly requested in relation to people who are travelling on, so as they then can follow up on where people are staying? Are you saying that there isn't going to be, you're not going to introduce mandatory restrictions, even in light of the high level of non-compliance?
Thank you, Deputy.
Thanks, Deputy. In terms of people who come in from the UK or South Africa, there are no direct flights, obviously, from South Africa, but people could come in from other airports. They are required to have a negative PCR test before they land in the country. That is mandatory. They are then strongly advised to self-isolate for 14 days. That is not mandatory. When it comes to information sharing with Northern Ireland, we have an information exchange. I understand that there are some difficulties in us sharing data with them. We're very happy to do that in principle, but I'm told there were some difficulties about the format of that and the detail of the requests and so on. But we will resolve that, and we do intend to resolve that. And then, as I say, the big flaw for Ireland in imposing 14-day hotel detention, mandatory quarantine for people arriving in our ports and airports would be largely ineffective because of the fact that we can't do that on the land border with Northern Ireland. Without stating the obvious, countries that have done this successfully generally are island states. We're an island geographically, but we're not an island state. Or they're countries like South Korea that have a very different type of border with North Korea than we have with Northern Ireland.
Thank you.